This conference will now be recorded.
Margo Kreger, who you're, I think, all familiar with. She is an ED student here at Allen College, and she's defending her dissertation today down the rabbit hole, a grounded theory of transitioning from practice to academia.
So I just want to say welcome. This is a very exciting day for me because I've been living this research now, I would say almost 4 years from when I started the doctorate program. So here we go. So transitioning from the practice setting to academia is very similar to falling down a rabbit hole and ending in a world that's brand new with a completely different culture and different language. So this presentation is going to provide the insight into the experience of transitioning of 8 health professionals as they moved from the practice setting to academia. So the purpose of this study was really to compare the process of transitioning from that practice setting to academia across health professions, in an attempt to identify how and when to best support that successful transition to the novice educator role. So as you can see, in the first 2 questions were part of my original research proposal. But the third question emerged following the data collection and led to the grounded theory that I will talk about later on in this presentation. So in reviewing the literature, I discovered that there's quite a few articles, studies done on transitioning. However, they were all done in silos. There were things that were done in the area of nutrition, physical therapy, occupational therapy, and nursing, but nothing looked at it cross disciplines, looking over that and combining the results. However, there was one study done in the UK that did look at transitioning from from the practice setting to academia, but again, it was done in the UK, which their educational system is different than ours. So the significance really of this study is currently there is a shortage of health professionals, educators. And so many institutions are currently recruiting experienced health professionals to come into the world of academia. But without understanding what that transitioning process is really like, institutions are at risk of losing these experienced health professionals once they have been recruited, or may not even be able to recruit because of not really truly understanding that experience of that health professional that is transitioning. So the method that I used in pursuing this research was developed by Kathy Charmez, and she is a constructivist grounded theory. And the theory really involves using intense interviews to collect data, identify themes in that data, compare it with the themes that are already available in the literature, and then put that together to construct meaning and to construct that grounded theory. One of the differences really between Charmez and other grounded theories is it does involve that constructing, and it does recognize that it is that interpretation of that researcher on that data to really put in that meaning and fully construct it, okay? So the experience of the researcher is highly valued in this, but she also really recommends that there's quite a bit of reflexology to really look at, reflexivity, to really look at, am I biased, and understand those biases in the process. So it's pretty intense and very laid out how to go about that. So I used 3 different, oops, sorry, probably should switch my slide. So I did use purposeful sampling in gathering my data. I wanted to use this type of method mainly because I was hoping to recruit those individuals that met that inclusion criteria specifically. Also, in doing that, I wanted to make sure that I had participants that represented a range of ages, that represented a range of experience in the academic setting and experience in the practice setting before that move, as well as looking at gender identity. Could I possibly be able to recruit participants that possibly were not just all female? And then also looking at having an equal number of participants from each discipline. So in doing that, I used 3 different methods of recruiting the participants. The first involved me looking at websites of colleges to see if they offered the program. So I was looking for programs in nursing, occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech language pathology, and social work. And if they offered that program, I was then going to that and looking at the faculty that were involved in that, hoping to maybe identify what, if they met that inclusion criteria. So for example, looking at, were they assistant professor versus an associate versus a full professor? Did they have a bio, which I identified later on that those that have bios have been teaching for quite a while. But trying to find that inclusion criteria. I grabbed the emails off of those websites, put them on my spreadsheet, and then went on to look at program directors of doctorate programs, thinking that perhaps a novice educator that is now teaching, maybe pursuing a higher degree, and possibly sending out the recruitment letters to these program directors to then send it on to their students to try to recruit more diversity. And then last was using a snowballing sample, asking the people that I did send emails out to, if you know somebody that may meet this inclusion criteria, could you please pass this on so that we could get the participants. And again, that goal was to try to have an equal number in each discipline. So 8 participants did contact me, and in contacting me, they determined the location and the time of the interviews via secured email that I used only for the research purposes. The interview did consist of a semi-structured interview process. However, first meeting the participants and reviewing the consent, I did ask those demographic questions, mainly to be able to gather that data to make sure that I have a diverse representation of participants, but also to, again, clarify and to make sure that they did meet my inclusion criteria. I then went into the questions that were more qualitative in the study. I shouldn't say more, they were. Such as, tell me about your experience in transitioning from the practice setting to academia. Was it what you expected? What was easy? What made it harder? And in true fashion of Charmaz, I would then ask even deeper questions. So as they said something, I tried to dig deeper, hoping to get as much depth as I could in those answers and be able to have a clear picture of what this true experience was like. And in each interview, after each interview, I transcribed it. I then read through it and wrote in the margins what kind of themes or initial codes may have emerged. I took those and I looked at what was currently in the literature to see if, were they similar, were they different? And then anything that might have been something I didn't really expect to come up so that I could possibly put that into the next interview. So in doing that, I did find that there were 2 concepts that did come up, or one concept that came up in the first interview, which was on leadership. The first participant that I interviewed had really talked a lot about how the leadership, how her own leadership skills, how the leadership of her program director had made a difference. So from that point on, that component was added to the interview questions. That was the only thing that was ever brought up that was truly different, that required a different question to be added to that semi-structured interview. So And then, sorry about that. And then I took those codes. And so, for example, when I got done doing all the interviews with nursing, I made a table and I looked at the codes that were there, what quotes supported those codes, and was I reading something into it that wasn't. So again, going back and really looking at were my own biases in here, or was this supported by the evidence that I had gathered. I then took the nursing codes, I compared those with all the occupational therapy codes, and then I compared those with the speech language pathologist codes. Again, looking for similarities, the differences, and cross-checking that. Every interview was cross-checked, and then the disciplines were also then again cross-checked. Okay. So following that initial coding, I embarked on doing memo writing and starting to write down what did I think this meant, where was this going. And I don't know if any of you had English lit in high school, but Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was one of the books we had to read. And I can tell you I read that book and it made absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. However, as I'm reading through the data collected, Alice in Wonderland kept popping up in the back of my head to the point where I actually put my research down, drove out and bought the book and read it. And as I read it, through the eyes of the data, it made sense. And so that's what led me to the metaphors, the characters, the events that happened in that book led to my focus codes, which guided the construction of my grounded theory. So that also, again, involved a constant going back to the data, going back to the literature, and then sitting down and talking about this with experienced qualitative researchers on, does this exist? Is this correct? Am I being biased, or are you seeing the same thing that I'm seeing? Especially when it was Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. I really needed to solidify that in my head. So the results of the study yielded data collected from 8 female healthcare professionals employed in 4 private and 1 public institution. There were 3 nurses that were represented, 3 occupational therapists, and 2 speech language pathologists. The age range was from the early 30s to mid 50s. Years of experience in practice varied from 6 to 25, and years in academia varied from just under their first year to almost meeting that 5-year mark. And then a variety of educational content was also discovered that was involved in either their professional degree or their post-professional degree. The next 2 slides I'm going to show you will show the 8 themes and the 9 sub-themes that emerged as a result of the study. I will define and provide supports with quotes of the themes and sub-themes in the subsequent slides here. So, chasing the white rabbit, was a calling, passing opportunity and obligation, falling down the rabbit hole, pool of tears with imposter Marianne, staying afloat, drink this, eat that. Questioning caterpillars, you don't know much and that's a fact, with the Mock Turtle's educational pedagogy, seeking a book of rules, afraid to ask. There's the dreadful Queen of Hearts, painting the white rose bush, and the supportive Cheshire cats. Before I go on to that, though, I want to talk about 2 other findings that did emerge. However, the first one, unaware of shared governance, was only presented by 1 of the participants. She just happened to mention that she had no idea that in academics there was shared governance and that she had a voice in what happened, and that was very unique to her. She thought, well, you're the boss, you should tell me what to do. But no one else ever mentioned that or talked about that as an issue. She had just brought it up as a side. And then the other was classroom management. And it was mentioned, but it did not constitute really at this point a separate theme. So classroom management did come up in some of the other themes, but it was part of that. So there wasn't enough evidence to pull that out separately. So here we go. So the white rabbit represents the trigger to move to academia from the practice setting. So this was what caused that person to decide, today I want to be an educator. That's the dream I want to follow. So chasing the white rabbit is chasing that dream. So I'll let you have a moment to read one of the quotes. The next sub-theme of that was a calling. And that's an inner desire to teach that has always been there. Now, some of these sub-themes actually, the participants may have felt more than one, but these were the ones that were explicit that the participants mentioned. So again, you can go ahead and look at that. Passing opportunities was recognize that window of opportunity may close, and I need to move now before it does close. So looking at taking advantage of the opportunity. If I'm going too fast, let me know. An obligation is defined as the obligation to the profession to educate the next generation of health professionals. And I had one participant that really talked about that directly, but the others, there was this more of an implicit meaning to that. So. The next theme is falling down the rabbit hole. And that's that unawareness of that you're entering a new world and a new culture. So that's what this theme is about. This theme, I think, really hit home, and I'll discuss it a little bit later, but the realization that you're novice again. Many of the participants did not recognize that they were going to be a novice again. And that led to, of course, a pool of tears. So. The sub-themes under a pool of tears, the first one is Imposter Marianne. And Imposter Marianne is that feeling that you don't belong, that others are going to notice, that they're going to recognize that you are an imposter and that you shouldn't even be here. Drink this and eat that is when you're trying different strategies to navigate the world of academia. So this is when that novice educator is trying to pull from whatever they have, whatever knowledge they had before, whatever resources, and figure out how to make things work. I really think Judy, the nurse, when she said, it's kind of been on my own research, my own kind of educating myself on how all of this works. I think really says that. The next theme, staying afloat, that's using the skills that were developed in that practice setting, such as leadership skills, to keep from drowning. So this is about just trying to keep your head above water and what that feels like. Jane here, when she said, I've been pushed into roles in different committees, she was really talking about how she had been placed in that novice position multiple times, and being in that novice position, again, was helping her to stay afloat. The questioning caterpillars. The questioning caterpillars are really those thoughts of self-doubt that sit on your shoulder. So it's that doubt that, did I make that right decision to transition to academia? Was this where I'm supposed to go? So again, Amy here is really looking at what happens when I'm away from the clinic. Am I still going to be considered credible? I'm credible now because I just came from the clinic, but what happens when I'm not? So those kind of self-doubts that continue. So of course, self-doubts lead us to find mentors. So you don't know much, and that's a fact. Really talked about insufficient mentoring. Some of the participants did talk about having mentors that were there for them, and they're very good mentors. But quite a few of the participants didn't have a mentor, or the mentor they had wasn't really able to answer the questions that they had. The sub-theme under that is Mock Turtle's educational pedagogy. What that talks about is the lack of knowledge of educational pedagogy. So if you're lacking that knowledge of educational pedagogy, it's really hard to engage in that conversation or the language that's being discussed in academics. So Carol, Bloom's, people threw out terms like Bloom's taxonomy all the time, and I had no idea what that was. So the next sub-theme is seeking a book of rules. And that's that need for a hard copy, something tangible, manual on policies and procedures in academia. These health professionals that were moving from the practice setting were used to having a hard copy. We're used to being able to look up something. And so there was a huge need to have that as well. And the last sub-theme in this category was afraid to ask. So again, that was that fear of bothering someone with questions or not knowing what to ask. So again, if I had that book of rules, I wouldn't have to ask. So, even if they had mentors, that fear of asking or bothering really prevented them from getting the assistance that they needed. Leading in from the afraid to ask goes into our next theme of the dreadful Queen of Hearts. And that's those illogical fear that if you make a mistake, there will be a dire consequence. So that fear of, if I don't have the correct syllabus right, the students will never pass, and it will be all because of me. So that's what that Queen of Hearts. To add to that, the painting of the white rose bush, which is that unanticipated workload. These participants that I interviewed came in thinking that all they were going to do was teach. That's all that's involved in education, is standing up here and teaching. And they found that there was much more to that workload, such as advising students, scholarship, service. Had no idea on how much time it took to make that lesson plan. So this is their comments on that. Right, and I know this looks like a lot of gloom and doom, right? We've got an unanticipated workload, things aren't like what we thought, but luckily we have supportive Cheshire cats. And the supportive Cheshire cat are the people that materialize just when the novice educator is ready to give up. They're the person that shows up at the door and says, hey, how are you doing? It could be the environmental service person that comes in at the end of the night to empty the garbage can and gives you a smile when you just think you're not going to make it. So this theme was really signified why people were continuing to stay where they were at, even though all the other stuff was going on. So from those themes and sub-themes, I constructed my grounded theory on down the rabbit hole. So I also looked at my conceptual framework, and William Bridges, just to give you just a brief idea of him, he talks about 3 phases of transitioning in general. Ending, which involves letting go, a neutral zone, which we'll talk about in the next few slides, and then the new beginning. And then Dreyfus discusses skills acquisition and the development of those skills. So the novice educator first has to decide, or I shouldn't say the novice educator, the experienced health professional has to first decide that they want to chase that white rabbit, that they want to pop down into that rabbit hole. So really what they need to do is they need to be able to let go of where they're currently at and follow through there. So one of the ways as a institution that we could do is we could offer opportunities to try teaching before. Let them have a flavor of what that's like. They could do a guest lecture, or they maybe volunteer in the classroom. And then encourage health professionals to be preceptors or fieldwork educators, so they have an opportunity to see what it's like to be able to counsel a student. However, the health professional at this point, before they jump into that hole, usually feels competent, if not feeling very expert and proficient in the skills that they've developed in the clinic. So what that does is it gives you that false sense that if I'm really good here, it should be no problem then stepping into this new role. And they don't realize that stepping into that new role is actually falling down into the rabbit hole. So when they first come on to campus, it's very similar to any other job, right? You have orientation, you get your badge, and it seems like the tunnel or the rabbit hole just goes nice and smooth. Then all of a sudden it drops, and they're in this new world. So some of the participants fell, if you've ever watched the movie Alice in Wonderland, the original Disney, Alice falls down the hole and she's like, oh, I'm just kind of gonna land here nicely. So some of the participants prepared for the fall. So they did do the guest lecturing. They might have gone on to get their clinical doctorate or their post-professional doctorate to prepare for that. But then others, well, they just jumped in. And it was more like Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland, if you want to go watch that movie tonight. And it was chaos, and things were thrown at them. So to help people in the falling down, the data collected, the recommendations in literature paired with the data that I collected were to have an organized orientation with the hard copy manual, something that they can write in the margins, knowing that it's going to change, but something that they can hold on to. And then adjunct possibly before full time. And then some of the participants that seemed like the transition was much more smoother did a lot of co-instructing first before they ever taught their own course, or were clinical instructors or in a course that they were very familiar with, versus like teaching neurology for the first time again. The next group fits into Bridges' neutral zone and the recognition that of Dreyfus that we're now a novice again, okay? So again, that's talking about the pool of tears, the questioning caterpillars, looking for those mentors, recognizing that you don't have the knowledge, that fear of asking, and that constant over your shoulder, when is the Queen of Hearts going to show up? Recognize I have not done the work I'm supposed to do and say, off with your head. So that's all going on in those first few, even years, I think, that, some of them were talking about that, what if I don't do this right? What if? And then why did I do this? Why, when I was an expert in my field, did I actually come here to be a novice again, all right? But they start recognizing that they do have skills, that some of the skills from the clinic can support them, or I should say the practice setting can support them in that transition. So recommendations, allocate more workload to learning that new role of an educator. Instead of just looking at the course, but looking at how can we get them to embrace that new role of an educator and take off some of the burden of the workload. Provide mentors that guide in each component of the educator role, that want to be mentors, that want to take on that responsibility. Provide mentors to the adjunct educators. That's another issue, they're adjunct and they're just coming in and leaving, and providing them that mentor, and so they have a better understanding of how the culture of academics works. Again, organizing the mentors, clear written guidelines and performance evaluations. One of my participants said that she had her evaluation done, and they said, well, we're disappointed in you because you've done no service. And she's like, I am president of this club, this club, this club, this club, but she didn't know to put that down, that was considered service. So looking at that as well. And then continue opportunities to engage in that professional development. And then the last phase is that new beginning, that new role as an educator, and being able to develop those skills of drive this. And the individuals that can help with that are those supportive Cheshire cats. Those people that come in and say, you know what, you are developing those skills. See, you were successful here. So again, recognition of skills the novice is acquiring, letting them know that they are making headway. Ask before adding more to their workload, having a conversation before you do that, and then provide names of others that can assist in the process. Real quick, some of the limitations to the study. Again, I only had, was limited to nursing, OT, and speech, and limited to the inclusion criteria that I set. The data saturation was attained across groups, but only partially within the group. So I was unable to fully answer the research question on the similarities and differences of the transitioning experience between disciplines. Again, limitation of the driving distance from the researcher. And I was really concerned that everybody, because this was going to be a great research project, that everybody would want to participate, and then how would I determine that you can or can't be in it? So I did more of a slower recruiting than I should have, and I think that was a limitation to the study. Factors that could have limited participation from speech, physical therapy, and social work. It could have been because those novice educators may have been pursuing their own doctorate, and so to take on an interview might have been difficult. There's a limited number of programs that are within the driving range, and then participants not meeting that inclusion criteria, possibly involving years of practice before entering academia. In this part of Iowa, we do a lot of raising our own, and that could have been part of it. Again, only female participants, and then also relying on data available on institutional websites for inclusion criteria was also a limitation. Suggestions for future research is expand the participant pool, expand the study to include professionals transitioning to the role of educator that aren't necessarily health professionals. Explore the influence of classroom management has on transitioning from the professionals to novice educator, and then allow participants to self-identify in future studies. The implications. So As far as implications go, looking at the accreditation agencies, I think some of the food for thought to look at is, consider regulations to allow a better balance of seasoned professionals and doctoral prepared research focused faculty. Is there a possibility that we can have more of a balance in that so that we can pull in that, that health professional that has 30 years of experience but is not really at the age of 60 want to go back and get a doctorate degree? Is there a way in which we can do that? Higher education organizations, provide the information that's necessary to develop and support your new faculty. Recognize that experienced health professionals does not equal experienced health educator, and that we need to be able to provide that support through an organized mentoring and orientation programs. Members of the faculty, offer information without being asked. You have somebody new in your department, take a look at what were the things I struggled with, and maybe go and check on that novice and say, hey, are you having difficulty with this? If you do, here's my name, number, call me and I'll come down and help you out with that, or I'll help to explain that if you have difficulty. So instead of waiting for them to figure out what's wrong, because when you're new, you don't know what to ask always, be the ones that reach out that hand and be that Cheshire cat. And then health professionals. Embrace being a novice again. Preparing for the transition to assist in that smooth transition is going to be better. So looking at what type of steps can I take to get involved in academia before I take that full-time position? What can I do to better prepare myself will make for a smoother transition. And also on that note, yes, it does seem very perilous and it does seem very, all this stuff. But the reality is there's nothing better than when you can make a difference in your profession by providing education to that next generation. So keep that in mind. All right, so in conclusion, when the novice embraces the nonsense, okay, they realize that what they thought was nonsense actually is practical in the education setting. The nonsense was more because they did not quite grasp and understand the culture and the language. But once they let go of the artifacts of the practice setting and say, here I am, this is where I want to be, that's when they get to start that new beginning as an educator. That's when they've embraced the nonsense and realized that this is where they need to be. So that concludes my presentation. Are there any questions? I'll get my little question slide so you guys know. Yes?
First time, Wednesday, I love it.
Thank you.
It's very creative. Then the only question that came up was just at the very end there. You had mentioned recommendations that sounded to me like how you would expand on the study or do things differently if you were to do a study ever. But I'm wondering if any other ideas for research came up, different problems you would explore that maybe came out of the interview data, some other angle that you would do.
I think it'd be interesting to really look at, let's say this. I went to a workshop in preparing all this, deciding on my topic, well, actually not deciding, but before I started writing my first few chapters at AOTA. And it was a workshop on transitioning from, as an OT to from practice setting to academia. And I sat in there and I thought it was fascinating that the people that were presenting, one of them had only been in the practice setting for 6 months. And I really felt like the things that were being said didn't really take into account. So I think it'd be interesting to see how people are determining, in a way, what should be involved in those kind of workshops. Because again, there's not much in the research that shows, there's excellent research in nursing on Anderson does this great mermaid theory, but doesn't really talk about, well, how do you get to decide you want to be a mermaid? You know, do you see the handsome prince on the beach? And that makes you decide, like, you know, but there's nothing that really talks about how do you entice, how do you get someone there, and I guess what determines content that are in these positions. I think the other thing that I found interesting is I had the opportunity to be at Dr. Ortiz's presentation, I'm saying that now for her, and it was on looking at mentors in the nursing field for male nurses. And I really wondered, because I was collecting data at the same time, if there's some type of a correlation, if it's really because they're men that they're having that, or is it related to the fact that they're novice? And we're looking at that as well. So I also don't think that there's been a lot looking at what it feels like to go from being the top of your field to being asked if you can maybe meet a real OT someday, or a real nurse, you know, as you're teaching. I think there is a lot of the pool of tears, if you can watch Alice in Wonderland now through this view, the pool of tears really, really hit home. I personally, that was probably the hardest thing for me, was that realization that I'm not. And that was with the participants too. I'm not the head honcho. People aren't coming to me. Now people question me constantly if I know what I'm doing. So I think it'd be interesting to look more into that angle as well. Yeah.
First of all, I thought your presentation was very well organized, excellent, provided great insight. I really enjoyed it, Margo. A couple questions I did have was, when you did your second interviews, you only did 3 participants and not the rest. Why was that?
The last 3 were mainly, or the second interviews were mainly to make sure that the supports that I was putting in fit. Because the interviews were all pretty much said the same thing throughout. So it was more of, am I getting this right? Is this actually where I'm going with that? So,
Other questions?
no, that's fine.
You selected the groups that you selected, the nursing, the social. Did you have a rationale for selecting those groups of people for this study?
Thank you for asking that. I was looking at those that were in bachelor programs or higher that were teaching in that. That would actually, going back to Dr. Broderson's question, would be another excellent research, is to see if the transitioning experience is the same in those that are teaching in an associate program or at a community college versus.
Because the principles are the same.
They are, but I was looking at more of, I think
That's
some
fine.
of those, yeah. No, I think that would be worth looking into to make sure. Again, I would love to expand this, so if there's anybody that wants to, like, you know, pay for me to continue on, I would love to go on and do pretty much anybody. Because even in putting this together and going through this, I realized I myself was going through the whole same process and just reaching for my doctorate. You know, of those feelings of I don't know anything to being able to build the skills up so that I can come and present today. So transitioning in general has really meant something to me. So I think that would be really interesting to go look at.
Another thing I think your study highlights along with other educators is that education isn't valued as much as it should be by other entities, and the difficulty and the amount of work that goes into it until you actually do it.
Exactly. That was the big take home. I had one participant quoted saying, I really appreciate all the work that my professors put into developing a lesson plan and lab and field work, because I never had any idea how long it took. So yeah, I think that as educators, we make it look easy. We really do. And people don't realize this part is the easy part, it's that behind the scenes. So,
So thank you.
yeah, Brenda.
One question. I thought it was interesting, and I've read your paper a couple times, but one thing that I thought was interesting that you made a point to say in your presentation was you wanted a hard copy of something in your presentation. And is that something that came through in your interviews, or is that something that you're projecting? Or is that something that's coming from that clinical side? I found it interesting that you made a point to include that.
It really came from that practice setting side. And that might change as we get more used to using computers, but I had one participant, I sat in her car for an hour and a half, and I bet you she said 20 times, I just want a hard copy of the guidelines. I just want something to look at. I know that they're going to change, but I just want something to look at. And I really think it's more that need to hold on to something substantial. But I also heard people say, well, you're supposed to look at something on, a policy or procedure on the website. Well, you don't know what's named. You don't know what it's called here. And it goes under different names. So even having a list of this policy addresses this policy addresses that, something that they can hold on to. And, I guess I equivocate that to anytime we're making that transition, sometimes holding on to that artifact. I mean, today I've got my artifacts on of my Alice in Wonderland to ground me, to support me. So I think it's just one of those ways that, do we have to have a 50-page or, with all the policies and procedures that we have, do we have to have a 100-page binder that we give them? Or can it be just something that's solid and small? I think that, again, I think this will change in time. It'll be interesting to see. But when you have health professionals that have been practicing for 15, 20 years, they're so used to that hard manual.
And I know I can speak to that because I read, I had read it and I was surprised. I think at least 3 out of your 8 had specific statements asking for something.
Something in writing.
Hard, something in writing, even though they knew that it was.
And I guess I don't find that surprising because our students, even in the classroom, are much younger than us. Because I hold on to the artifact because I'm old and I like a paper copy. I'd rather read a paper book than, but our students would too. Our students tell us time and time again, they don't want the electronic copy of the book, they want the hard copy. So I guess,
So you can write in the margins and you can.
It's just curious that some things that showed up when you think about healthcare being very dynamic and people coming from a clinical setting, and then they want that tangible one.
And I don't know if this is also part of that, but if you've ever been, if you've ever been in a situation where you have to present something right away and your computer crashes. And in healthcare, that does happen, where the computer, you can't get out to the computer, and then therefore you can't, issue the medications, you can't follow the schedule, you can't get that report off. So I think there might be some of that there, which would be another thing to look into.
Also can give some insight into that, especially as an adjunct, when you don't have a laptop that's from here and you're using your own personal computer, you can't access the shared drive. So you actually have no way of accessing those documents as an adjunct at all.
Yes.
Yes, obviously I fit into the role, though I'm not a healthcare provider, but I, had 10 years
Well,
in the
it was
field and then transitioned. I wasn't for the most past. But, so I, some that I identified with and some that I didn't, because I imagine I had maybe a softer landing because I didn't come from healthcare, which is regimented. It's very rules driven, and then you are given complete independence and academic freedom. And I imagine for me it's probably softer because I came from more of a theory background and programs, again, more of a softer science. And so then when I got, again, this kind of complete independence to build stuff, that wasn't as unusual to me. And so I imagine that would be a rougher transition for that reason. When you talk about artifacts, that made me think of that like, well, no, I never had any of this stuff. I was always just winging it as I went anyway. My entire career. When you put together a health intervention primary level. You just research and you pull it together and you hope it works, based on best practice, but I did charter, anything like that.
Well, and that's why I really wanted to see social work as well. And so I am interested to know kind of how they may get into education. I think that would be interesting to know because social work, I mean, yes, it is a health profession as well, but it has a different venue, similar to public health.
Yeah,
So-
and on the other hand, you're gonna get fewer as you stray away from clinical medicine. You're gonna get more professors who just went straight out of doctoral programs and teaching.
Right.
Even in
Right.
public health, I'm a fair rarity who actually worked in the field before
Right.
transitioning into academia.
Right.
In medicine, in medical, you have a lot less of that. You have people
Right.
who worked in
Right.
the field and then transitioned later.
Right.
So if you stray too far, you're gonna have a whole lot of trouble
Yes.
recruiting somebody.
Well, and I just know that, I don't know how many times the participants said, they were the top, why did they give up being the top? So, and then they see their students and all that. Any other questions? I just want to real quick give some special thanks. Sorry, my caterpillar is going to start talking to y'all. I just want to just say some special thanks. I want to officially thank Dr. Brenda Barnes. She was my external reviewer, and I think that is a really, really difficult position to be in, especially when you're dealing with someone that's extremely passionate about your dissertation, to have the courage to come up and bring forth ideas and thoughts that may not necessarily be the, yeah, you're the best type of thing, but that needed to be discussed. So I just want to really thank her for her bravery of being able to be there and giving me the feedback that I really needed to move forward in my dissertation and making it better and being able to give this presentation. So thank you, Brenda. I want to thank Dr. Jackie Meyer. She is my person that finds those little tiny things, because I know it's hard to believe, but I think really big and a little bit crazy on occasion. And I had, when I was picking people for my committee, I had specifically picked Dr. Meyer because I knew that she would support, but would also be able to pull me in when I needed it, and to be able to fine tune it, so that I'm very, very happy, very pleased with my dissertation, and I'm very grateful. And then there's Dr. Denise Crowley. And I want to thank her for, well, they're all my Cheshire cats, but Dr. Crowley figured me out from the very beginning. And when I first went to her with the initial codes of this, it was just basically insufficient mentors, unanticipated workload. And she said, well, tell me more about it. I said, well, I read Lewis Carroll, and I got all excited. I think that she was probably in her office longer than she had planned. And I just spewed out all this information on Lewis Carroll. And I think this is working. And she looked at me and she said, why then are you settling for these codes? That's not where you need to go. You need to go to these now focused codes. And she has always been, you got to show who you are, and has always appreciated that. And I have really enjoyed this journey. Today's kind of a tough day because, yes, hopefully I will pass my defense. But I don't know what I'm going to do when I'm not thinking of Alice every day. My 12-year-old drew me a picture of a girl falling down a hole. So obviously I talk about this way too much at my house. And it said, falling down a rabbit hole is no ordinary roll. So one of these days I'm going to get t-shirts made, my merch that I'll start selling. But I just want to say thanks to my committee, because I would not be here without them. So thank you. And thanks everybody for coming. Thank you. Thanks, Jackie Meyer, or not Jackie Meyer, Jackie Jaspers, if you're still there.